Forced to work from home by your employer? Laid off or feeling depressed at home? Do you want to make money working from anywhere? We'll show you how to do it from your couch. It's time for another episode of the Work From Home Show. Coming to you from their homes in Austin, Texas and Tampa, Florida, here are your hosts, Adam and Naresh.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Work From Home Show. I'm Naresh Vissa with Adam Schrader. I want to wish all of our homies, homeboys, homegirls, home trans, all the work from homers out there. Hope things are going well right now. It's been a tough year, obviously. But Adam, did you happen to catch a very popular show on Netflix called Indian Matchmaking? I want to start talking about that.
I haven't. My wife has.
Oh, so did she watch the entire show?
I think so. I don't know. I never have. So, but I think she did.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'll say this for all our listeners: we might have touched on this show on a previous episode, and I'll venture out to say that at least 50% of Indians under the age of 40 have watched this show. So that's quite a few people around the world who've watched this show. And why do I bring this up? Why do I bring up Indian Matchmaking? What does that have to do with our show? Because there's one guy on the show who was called a loser. Yeah. And we've got him on the line because, Adam, that's who we want to interview on our show, right? We think those losers are the best types of people who add value to our audience, right, Adam?
Yeah, I do remember with the show, the one thing I remember is they said that all Indians know each other, and I texted you about it, and you were like, oh yeah, I know that person.
Yeah. Well, I actually did have connections to 3 of the people on the show. Including the one who called our guest on today's show a loser. But let me just quote really quickly, because it's going to set the stage for our show, which I think is going to be a really, really good show. So on the show, and I'm going to quote our guest, his name is Srini Rao. He, I guess you can say the woman who we went on a date with, she said, quote, in 20 years, so I want to be sitting on the couch with a person looking for the perfect job. I will talk to you never, end quote. And we're going to talk about that quote because right now, during these times, there are a lot of people sitting on the couch who don't have any jobs. They may have lost their job, or they're still looking for that job, and it's a problem that tens of maybe hundreds of millions of people around the world are dealing with. And then the next quote that she said, quote, I'm someone who's very driven and ambitious. I also want to see that in the other person. He wasn't very ambitious about his own career path or his own trajectory, end quote. So let's talk about the credential of our guest today, Srini Rao. He's the host of the Unmistakable Creative Podcast. And I've listened to a few of the episodes on this show over the past couple of years. And I'll tell you, this is not a loser podcast. Former guests have included Dilbert creator Scott Adams. I'm a huge fan of his and love his recent work talking about politics. Tim Ferriss, who we've talked about on this show, Seth Godin, Glenn Beck. These are not kind of
a bunch of losers.
Random. Okay, yeah, I guess. Actually, a lot of them have been. I think Glenn Beck and Scott Adams have been called losers a lot over the past few years. But anyway, the show has over 1,500 5-star reviews on iTunes, which I'll tell you, Adam, we're up to 100. I don't know if you saw, we're up to like 120, I want to say. And 120 ratings, not necessarily 5-star. And it took a while for us it took a lot of hard work to get up there. You know how much we've put into this podcast. And Srini Rao is also the best-selling author of some really, really good books that we're going to talk about today called The first one is called Unmistakable: Why Only is Better Than Best. Also, the book The Small Army Strategy, a guide for turning fans and followers into fanatics and friends for life. And the new book, The Scenic Route, What I've Learned from a Life That Hasn't Turned Out the Way I Thought It Would. Sounds like some like a loser would write such 5-star best-selling books. So anyway, without further ado, Srini Rao, welcome to the Work From Home show.
Thanks for having me. That was an interesting introduction, but thanks for having me. I'll tee it up to you guys to ask the first questions, because
after that intro, I'm sure he's glad he's here.
Yeah. Well, let's first talk about what we discussed. Let's talk about just kind of your general thoughts on our introduction. And first off, the Indian Matchmaking show on Netflix. How did you get involved with that? Like, did they have an open call for auditions?
No. First, I'm definitely not the type of person who would audition for anything like that. Here's what happened was I was in touch with an old friend from college who mainly has known of me from, the work that you mentioned, Unmistakable Creative, the books and all that stuff. And she was in a course that actually that was this year, but she had, sort of been following my work for some time. And she just sent me an email and said, hey, a friend of mine is producing this documentary. They're looking for people. You should, we're wondering if you'd be interested. And I was like, all right, cool. Like in my mind, best case scenario, I meet somebody awesome. Worst case scenario, I'm the most eligible Indian bachelor in America, and book sales and podcast downloads skyrocket. So I just didn't see, a downside to it really. But that's how I got involved. Now, as far as some of the things that were said, man, there are a lot of ways to go about this, and people have, kind of asked about somebody asked on Instagram, and I've yet to answer it, like about my sort of choice to take the high road. I'm like, well, what other road is there to take? I just finished writing this article on Medium about the 10, sort of universal principles from Hindu mythology that can still guide our lives today. And one of them was about choosing your words. Every now and then, if you have a public presence of any sort, you're going to get vicious emails, poor reviews, etc. Right? That probably happens to you guys. You're like, okay. So the thing is, like a couple weeks ago, some woman wrote me this lengthy, angry message. You know what I did with it? I deleted it. I didn't even bother to think about the amount of energy and time that went into that, and she got nothing out of it. So you kind of have to ask yourself, like, did she really think that would do anything? Like nothing came from it because she chose to project her anger onto me for some strange reason, which is fine. But you got to ask yourself, just because it's easy to troll, some public figure on social media or say mean things about them, you really have to ask, okay, well, great. What good is going to come from that? None. And so the thing is that, to me, there's really no sense in defending any of this, because it was kind of like, I know the truth. The people who matter to me know the truth. And, you yourself have pointed out, my credentials speak for themselves, and I'm not going to be looking for the perfect job in 20 years because I already have the perfect job. I just didn't, feel the need to rave about it. My brother-in-law got on my case about this. He said, you really downplayed everything you did, which is, to some degree true. My only regret was that I didn't mention the name of the podcast, which was a stupid oversight. But there was the reason for that was I wanted to be judged on my character, not my credentials. And, Naresh, you're Indian, so you know this. Indian people are among the most judgmental people in the world when it comes to credentials. I ended up writing this entire other article on Medium titled "The South Asian Arms Race for Impressive Biodata." And
wow, that sounds good. We'll have to
think
put
about
that in our show notes.
Yeah, well, the thing is, let's just kind of dissect this idea a little bit. The thing is that you kind of learn very early on when you grow up in an Indian family that what people respect is credentials and achievement. It's that sort of distinction between what David Brooks calls resume values versus eulogy values. And the thing is that there's such an emphasis on resume values in this culture that it often gets basically buried under character. Even, in the process of, being interviewed by the matchmaker, like I remember the questions, it was like, oh, do you have a preference on occupation, school this person went to? I was like, did you read my profile? Do I seem like a person would give a shit about any of those things? But it was also very telling because, I was like, I'm not hiring somebody for a fucking job here. I'm looking for a life partner. There's a difference. And even when my roommate asked, I was like, what's the difference between LinkedIn profiles and bio data? I said, nothing. It would be like your LinkedIn profile had your romantic preferences on it and they would be the same. And the funny thing is, if you look at bio data, typically what it leads with is a person's accolades. It says nothing about what they're like as a person. So, I think that there's that. The other thing that you kind of have to realize is that, I've been in the public eye for the better part of like 9-10 years before this. And
is that because of your books or?
Yeah, books, podcasts, all that stuff, right? So I've had a public presence. And the thing is that what you have to understand is on any media platform, particularly one as significant as Netflix, and none of us imagined that it was going to get as big as it did. Everything you do in the public eye is a reflection on every single other person who is associated with you in some way, whether that's, investors, editors, publishers, agents. So how you carry yourself and how you present yourself actually matters. You can't just shoot from the hip when you're in the public eye and say whatever the hell you want. So yeah, did I think any of that was kind? No. Did I, but again, what the hell would the point be to fighting all that crap? What would I gain from, defending this and getting into fights over it? Nothing. So anytime somebody brought it up, and even when you emailed me, I said, look, I'll talk about it, but like no specifics, like I'm not going to say anything bad about anybody. And even when people tried to kind of engage me in that, I said, look, people said a lot of nice things about me. I mean, the comment of, oh, you dodged a bullet over and over came through. I mean, literally that, must have been the text I received 1,000 times. Absolutely. And even, when complete strangers, would message me on Instagram and say that, I was like, and they would say something really nice to me, I would just say, thanks so much. That's very kind of you. I hope you check out the podcast. Because like there's an opportunity I can either engage in this, pointless bullshit that's not going to add anything to my life, or I can redirect all that and be like, yo, cool. I'm glad you like, thanks for being nice. And I hope you check out the podcast. Because what am I going to benefit? I can either gain a new listener or I can engage in pointless bullshit. And, the first is going to do far more for me, in the long run. So that's kind of how I kind of think about all this. I mean, here's the thing. It's a weird experience to be in the public eye in that sort of big a capacity. But the other thing is it's temporary. Nobody gives a shit about it. It's like, we've been out for 2 months. Like nobody's really talking. I mean, it was like, all the rage for about 3.5 weeks, but that's how media works. It's this like moment in time and it's all temporary. So any elevation in status or, notoriety that comes from it eventually goes away and, nobody cares. Like, and the truth is I'm not interested in building, a career from, a brief moment on reality TV. Like I have no interest in that.
Yeah. And a couple of things. I was featured in a Bloomberg Business Week magazine a couple of weeks ago because I'm voting for our current president, President Trump, and they did a small little feature. And I mean, I was actually overwhelmed. I was like, whoa, all of a sudden people care about me. And on Twitter, people came in hard. And going back to, I'm not as public as you are. Your podcast does way better. You've sold way more books than I have. But I mean, thousands of there were probably more than 2,000 tweets or direct messages coming my way. The bulk of them, which were Chinese bots, I think that's what my Reputation folks said looking into them. But you're absolutely right in that you can't waste your time. And your books talk about this. There's so much more about personal development and focusing on our own lives that we can't get carried away by random people sending us messages on Twitter or Instagram. It's just a complete waste of time. It's not productive. And it can really, if you don't have that thick skin, it can destroy you, I think. So that's my first thought. But my next question is, you said that you went on the Netflix show because you thought, oh, the worst case scenario, this will help my books and my podcast. I'll say you wouldn't be on this podcast promoting yourself if it weren't for that show. So has that happened though? Have you seen a spike in books and podcast listeners?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely have seen a spike in new listeners checking us out and all of that. Again, my view has always been for the long run, right? I mean, I've been doing this for 10 years, so the thing about moments like this, right, is not to get caught up in them, leverage them for what they are, but it really, to put your head down and do your work.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. What surprised me about the experience you had on the show, did she not Google you? Because you said that you downplayed yourself, which I was actually telling my wife. I was like, man, this guy, he's smooth, he's confident, he doesn't need to hype up, I'm this author and this podcaster and I'm this and this and I make all this money. I thought you did a great job, but did she not Google you, or did the show not tell the participants, like, hey, this is a person's name who you're going to be meeting?
I mean, I couldn't tell you that. I have no idea. It's one of those things where, I did my part and that was that, but I honestly don't have a clue.
Okay. Yeah. And we could be here all day talking. You said Indian people are some of the most judgmental people you've ever come across, which I was telling some non-Indian friends of mine that the only discrimination I've faced over the last 10 years or so has been against my own community discriminating against.
Yeah, not surprising.
And you brought up the whole credentials, and I have a master's degree. I believe you have a master's degree too, but I mean, that's like the holy grail. If you don't have a master's degree, like, you are immediately ostracized from the community. It's strange, but that's just how it goes.
You mentioned that people kind of sent you the hate stuff and you've been telling them to listen to the podcast. How has the impact on your business been from the show?
I've been very fortunate in that I've received almost no, hatred. Like, it's been overwhelmingly positive. That's the thing, right? Is that, like, I, was the one who's painted like a prince next to a villain. And I also made a point to say I would not engage in bashing this other person because, here's the thing, man, to your question, it definitely has, like you pointed out, I wouldn't be talking to you guys if it hadn't been for this thing. So, it's led to a couple of things. But, I mean, overall, I've made the best thing about it was reconnecting with old friends who I hadn't talked to in a really long time, like friends, family members, because so many damn people saw this thing. But again, even if you get the idea of a public figure, it's easy to forget that, like, even if you can't stand somebody or they do sort of, things that are just reprehensible or annoying, they're still people, man. On the other end of every tweet you send, email you send, like, there is a human being who has feelings, no matter how, thick-skinned and, unshakable they appear to seem. So I think that that's really important. This is why, like, I just, I didn't engage. I made a point never to engage anything where things were just, where I just saw, I was like, okay, this is just somebody bashing another person. So yeah, like I said, there's really, in all honesty, to me, it's kind of like this bizarre moment in time that, like I said, it's a month later, nobody cares anymore.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. Now, let's talk about one of the things you mentioned on the show, which I think is extremely prevalent to a lot of people, especially millennials. So I read a stat that 52% of millennials are now living at home with their parents. Actually, not millennials. It was people above the age of 18. So that would be Gen Z as well. They're now living at home with their parents. And you mentioned on the show that you lived with your parents, I think, until you're like mid to late 30s. So tell us about that. Why did you do that? I believe you have an MBA from Pepperdine. And how did you kind of, I guess, discover your true calling while you were at home living with your parents?
Well, so I had this really unusual situation in that I graduated April 2009 from business school, which is a time to get out of any kind of school, let alone business school, because you kind of went from, almost overnight from being in this economy where we had been rewarded for fitting in to now being in one where you're rewarded for standing out. And, I remember reading things like recruiters would get like 1,000 resumes of overqualified people for one position, and no recruiter can go through 1,000 resumes. So they print out all 1,000, take off the first like 800, throw them in the garbage and go through 200. So you're like literally, flushing paper down a toilet into like this digital vortex. And I just knew that there was no way that, through traditional means, I would be able to find a job. Because there was this idea at that time that like, when the economy recovers. And I think what people never understood was that what recovery was going to look like is going to be very different than what they thought, right? Recovery didn't mean, all the jobs that were, gone were coming back. How many of those jobs have come back? Basically all that did was reveal how many people worked in like bullshit jobs and got paid a lot of money to do it, like jobs that are completely unnecessary, because that's just how innovation and technology works. But it also creates opportunity. And the thing is that I really saw that, okay, I'm sitting here at my parents' house. This is, summer of 2009, keep in mind. I can either sit here wallowing in my misery or do what my classmates are doing, which, I had a classmate who I remember posting a Facebook status saying she'd literally applied to every job on the internet. I was like, that is the dumbest fucking thing I've ever heard. Because it is like, why, like, are you really going to go? Yeah. I mean, that is like the height of stupidity and inefficiency. So I, sort of had this unusual 8 or 9 month stretch where, I realized that, okay, I can do something with this time. So, I picked up surfing, which is a fantastic hobby for an unemployed person because it takes a ton of time and it doesn't cost any money. And like, you can't just sit in front of a computer and apply for jobs all day. So what happened was I basically just started writing. I started my first blog. And the irony is, of course, I started that blog as a way to stand out of the job market with no idea that the ship would sail as far off course as it has. So, fast forward to the end of 2009, I finally get a job at an online travel company, moved to an apartment in LA at the beginning of January, and I'm at that job for about a year, moved to Costa Rica for 6 months, and I come back to my parents' house. And, my parents said, okay, apply for jobs and build this thing on the side, which I was doing. But what was happening is that my public presence was getting, more and more substantial, while my, ability to find a job was getting lower and lower. And I was running into the situation where when I would get interviews, the thing that would open the door would be my body of work. And that would also be the reason people would say they didn't want to hire me, because they'd say, oh, this looks like you're going to leave the moment you don't need us. And I was like, yeah, that's true. I have no intention of building a long-term career.
That's how jobs work these days.
Yeah, I mean, there's, as people probably have learned from this pandemic situation, like there's no such thing as loyalty in corporate America. I'm sorry to say that, but
2008, 2009.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is it doesn't matter how reputable, secure, big, company is. The reality is that the economy fundamentally changed. Tyler Cowen, the economist, wrote this book called Average is Over. I don't remember when that book came out, but it was a really kind of, accurate prediction of the world that, we're headed for. A world in which, as Chase Jarvis once told me, people who are growing up now will likely have 5 jobs at the same time. And we have a system that doesn't, accommodate for that. Like we haven't built an educational system or an institutional structures to, enable that. And the other thing I realized at that time was, I spent my whole life working at jobs I've hated, following this bullshit life plan that was handed to me by, people who don't have to deal with the outcomes of the life plan. And I think that really, those two realizations, combine that with surfing, kind of, led me down this path. I mean, the interviewing thing was largely accidental. It was an online course, this guy who had, and one of the lessons was to interview people. So I basically did a weekly series called Interviews with Up and Coming Bloggers. And the people I interviewed were, people who nobody has ever heard of. And the funny thing is, to this day, I still interview people that nobody has ever heard of. And they're some of our most popular podcast guests, because I understood early on that it was never going to be the status of the guest that caused the show to grow. It was going to be the quality of the work that I did. And so that really kind of put me on this path to doing this. Interviews really kind of emerged naturally. Like I found that I had this, what it was is that when I'm behind a microphone, like everything else disappears. Like I'm the most ADD person in the world. In fact, girls who go on dates with me get pissed off because they say I don't listen, which is ironic considering that I make a living listening to people.
Yeah.
But the thing is, when, I turn on the microphone and I'm talking to somebody, there's something just happens. It puts me into flow, and that's it. Like, the rest of the world disappears, and I'm just captivated by what I'm doing. And that's, to make a long story short, kind of how we got here. And of course, it's led to all this other stuff, book deal with publishers, opportunities to do speaking gigs. We just raised a round of venture funding. So that's kind of where that's the, long version, the short version of what could be a ridiculously long story.
One of the things you just mentioned is you started your blog as kind of your way to get in. You also mentioned on your website, the Unmistakable Creative, that a lot of the things people think of, one of the big ones is, who the hell wants to hear from me? I'm not an expert. What made you decide that people might want to hear from you and that you could become an expert?
I don't think that I ever thought of, I never thought that, necessarily that I was an expert or that people would want to hear from me. I thought I had something to say and I wanted to say it. And, I think I had this sort of default impulse to look at anything when technology comes out and ask, what could I make using this? And sometimes it leads to ridiculous shit. Other times it leads to something worth, that deserves an audience. I'll give you the most ridiculous example. So, there's all the cool stuff coming out with AI. I'm just screwing around with it. Of course, I found this, tool to remove the background from a photo. And, there's a picture of one of my roommates, like, with his hand up against a mountain. And he's looking at me, trying to modify this picture. And he's like, "You're looking for a girl with boobs to put in that picture, aren't you? So it'll look like I'm touching somebody's boobs." I was like, "Yes, that's exactly what I'm doing." But the thing is, it's, the thing is, like, I'm not doing that to, like, post that on Instagram anywhere or like that. But I have this natural tendency to tinker with new technology when it comes out, which leads to a lot of sort of creative. So, that to me is really what was driven by it. It was driven by is not necessarily the desire to be like, oh, I'm an expert or I'm an authority. Like, I've built a base of knowledge from years of work. And that's kind of how credibility and authority works, right? Because we live in this world where, yes, anybody can, sort of put up their shingle and be like, I do this, this, and this. But so often they don't have any credibility to back it up, or they don't have the experience to back it up. And you have to start somewhere. Like, everybody starts at zero. And if you go and you trace the progression of any content creator who you think has, like, a massive presence or is somebody, famous, like, go look at Seth Godin's first blog post, go look at Gary Vaynerchuk's first video. None of them started out the way they did today. All these big things start small. And that's the thing I think that people have to understand when you feel like, oh, I have, who am I to say something? Well, you have a life experience, you have an opinion, and, you have to have the courage to share it regardless of what people think. Like, I had no idea that you were going to vote for our current president, and, like, I don't agree with that, but you're fine saying it, and that's cool. Like, then to me, that's kind of that's the thing, right? Like, authority is something you develop through experience is what it comes down to. And the only way you're going to get that experience is by doing things and trying things. So I don't think that it was because I thought I had something to say, but I think it was that I had this just impulse to want to make things.
Yeah, whenever you're talking about how their voice now isn't the same as it was when they started, I remember I was talking with Rob Walsh, who's a bigwig at Libsyn a few years ago. And he told me that his recommendation to podcasters is sit down and record 10 episodes and then throw them away and start over.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's that. There's also publish them, find out what people think, and then publish 10 more. There are a lot of things. Like, I did my own editing for probably 400 or 500 episodes. Like, I didn't have an editor. And I think that was invaluable because I had to listen to every single thing I did multiple times. And I still go back and I listen to every single episode we do, not, just to hear the sound of my own voice, but because I'm looking actually for what I could have done better.
Yeah, absolutely. So talking about, well, first off, what you just said in the question that Adam asked about being an expert, that was asked on Indian Matchmaking. It was, okay, you write these books, you have this podcast, but how are you an expert? That ties into my next question of, what's your advice to the hundreds of millions of people worldwide who right now are stuck in their life, probably stuck at home and maybe even having like this block of creativity.
Well, look, you can see any crisis as a crisis, or you can see it as an opportunity. And the thing is that the funny thing is that right now you're given one gift that is absolutely priceless that you will never get back, and that's the gift of time. Here's the thing. I had that very unusual 9-month stretch post-business school with no job, nothing to do. Most of my classmates sat around lamenting the shitty job market, updating their status all day. And the thing is that, like, you got to remember, like, Seth Godin had this great quote where he said, the best way to be where you want to be a year from now or 10 years from now is to do something today that you'll be glad that you did.
Yeah.
And so, the thing is that you have ideas, you have projects. Yeah, you might not have, the financial resources to build the next Facebook or, create the next Uber. Maybe you don't have the intellectual capacity to, build the next killer app. But the thing is that if you're willing to just do things and try things and play, you just don't know where it's going to lead. And look, as I told you, I didn't plan to have this career as like an author, speaker, whatever it is that, that I do now. It just kind of came about organically because I was willing to just keep putting stuff out there. I mean, I got a book deal because of a blog post on Medium. I wrote something like 1,000 articles before that, and so that's the thing that I think people often don't understand is that there's often, great opportunity inside of a crisis. So it's funny you're asking this because like I have to give a talk about this to a company. And so I came up with this model of what I call the 5 stages of crisis, which is like the 5, my friends like you basically co-opted the 5 stages of grief. I'm like, yes, basically. But the thing is that like, sort of the first moment in crisis that we experience is panic, right? So that's your just natural biological impulse of fear and all the anxiety and all that other stuff. Like, and the thing is that most people, panic is that just sort of instinctive response to any sort of crisis, like, oh my God, the world's going to fall apart, everything's going to go to shit, type of thinking. But the thing is that panic almost immediately, evolves into projection. And the thing is that when you project, what the meaning of a crisis, what ends up happening is that you start to basically paint a picture of the future that you more or less bring about through your, own actions, because of the fact that all you see is, the worst that could happen when, there's a lot of opportunity. Now, the thing is that what we know from sort of human behavior, right, is human beings have this capacity to pause between stimulus and response, which, Viktor Frankl said is often, that's where life happens, is in that pause. But the thing is, when you panic, you don't pause. And the reality is that, through sort of basic practices of like meditation, unplugging, all the kind of stuff that, makes its way into sort of, personal development literature, and some of which I call new age bullshit. Some of it has a lot of, validity to it. And so if you resist that temptation to panic, then suddenly what happens is you can actually go into this next phase. Now, what happens inevitably, right, is that you go into projection from panic. And inside of projection, fear, sort of that voice in your head, the inner critic, dominate the way that you think about this, the way that you see what the future could look like. Now, the thing is that, what you don't understand about the inner critic, right, is there's nothing that the inner critic hates more than being challenged or having its authority questioned. And so, if you keep sort of asking the inner critic, why am I such an idiot, like blah, 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 whatever it is, right, it's going to give you evidence to back that up. But there's only one way to silence the inner critic. Like the sort of standard, thing that people try to do when they're dealing with this voice in their head, I know this from personal experience, is that they ruminate and they just replay this voice over and over in their head, and like it just perpetuates, worst case scenarios. And as a result, you sort of turn fact into fiction. eventually that fiction becomes the facts of your life. And, it's what Stephen Pressfield calls resistance in a lot of ways. So, if what you're doing is making up stories anyways, you might as well make up a story that, serves you rather than sabotages you. So you get from that to a certain point where you have to, you go from panic to projection to acceptance. Now, this is among probably the most, all of these are the most uncomfortable phases of this whole, idea of turning crisis into opportunity. But at a certain point, you have to accept the fact that some things are never going to change. Girl breaks up with you, decides she doesn't want to be with you. At some point, you have to accept the fact that she's never coming back. I'm speaking through personal experience. Or you can sit around and ruminate. But here's the funny thing about rumination. If you haven't any of these experiences, or you have a bad experience, you get fired from a job, dumped by a girl, whatever it is, you keep playing that stupid, loop over and over in your head, trying to find some sort of answer. And then when you get done with it, you realize that no matter how many answers I seek inside of that rumination, the outcome is still exactly the same. I'm still exactly where I'm at. And so the thing is that, you have to accept the fact that, yeah, we're in a pandemic. There's, parts of this you can control and parts of it you can't. You might have lost your job. That sucks. And I'm not, this is not meant to be, sort of not empathetic towards those people. I mean, that is really, really tough. I mean, and the thing is, but you also remember people always have it worse than you do in many cases. And, you have it better than other people. We never tend to compare ourselves to people who have it worse. We always compare to people who have it better. But the thing is that if you can accept where you're at, then suddenly the future becomes a blank slate, as opposed to fighting where you're at and causing, the future to look exactly like your past does. And the thing is that once you have that sort of, you've arrived at that place of acceptance, right? You go through the panic, you project all its bullshit, you've accepted the circumstances of where you're at. That's where you get perspective. And in perspective, you can basically say, okay, what did I learn? How can I mitigate the kind of disaster that I'm dealing with in the future, or that I'm dealing with now? And what are the uncontrollable factors to account for? And then, of course, what do you make this mean? I could have made it mean that, getting out of business school in 2009 with no job was all gloom and doom. But I didn't, I did. Right at the time, it was like the worst thing in the world. But once you have that with perspective, you end up taking a very different kind of action. And that kind of in a nutshell is what I would say.
You talking about all the articles you wrote on Medium makes me think of how people don't realize that most overnight successes are 10-year overnight successes. But can you talk a little bit about what you write about on your site about the 4 key elements to living a productive and rewarding creative life?
Yeah, I mean, so this is really the foundation of our Unmistakable Creative Prime program to help people make ideas happen. But the basics of it are this, right? Attention management, which is critical in a world full of distractions. As you know, there are 1,000 things competing for our attention at any given moment. And if you are constantly shifting your attention from one to the other, you can't go deep enough into one to actually make any traction with it. The other is habit formation, which is another critical component of this, because the reality is James Clear once said that habits are the compound interest of self-improvement, and that's the same case with creative careers. Like the more you make, the more it has a compound effect. So making art is the compound interest of a creative career. The next component of this is systems, which, I'll give you the basic overview of this because it's like I've just finished writing a 7,000 word piece on this. But if you look at professional creators, I mean, hell, just look at any company. They all are organized with systems, and there's a reason for that, because if you have systems in place, you don't spend your time organizing work. All the energy that goes into organizing all your work goes into actually fucking doing it. And then finally, the last piece is community. There's sort of this idea of the lone wolf or superstar, because have this person in the public eye. They're the ones who are in the spotlight. But what you don't see is there are 1,000 people behind the scenes who play a role in all of that, right? I don't get to do what I do just because of my own efforts. You know, I have a community manager. I have literary agents that, you know, basically negotiate book deals, you know, cover designers, artists. I mean, there's so many people that, you know, go into making whatever you do happen. Your name might be on the cover of a book, but there are literally 100 people whose name is never in the spotlight that actually play a far bigger role than people realize. And that's the case with anything. Like you can't achieve anything great without the help of other people. And so those are really the four foundational pieces.
We have Srini Rao on the show. He is host of the Unmistakable Creative Podcast and best-selling author of multiple books. Srini, you use the term unmistakable. So your company is called Unmistakable Media, the Unmistakable Creative Podcast. What is your goal and mission with, I guess, the term unmistakable? What does it mean? What is unmistakable work? And is everyone an unmistakable artist?
So that's a big question, obviously, which kind of is the center of what I've been doing for the last 10 years. So let me tell you where it came from. I think you need some sort of context to understand this. So, you know, I started out interviewing bloggers, as I told you, and I think over the better part of 3 or 4 years, I started to notice a pattern that was just driving me insane. Basically, it was that people would see somebody do something, some person who had some degree of success do something, then they would try to copy that thing to the letter and expect to get the same results and be surprised that they didn't. And I'm like, of course you didn't, because you're the very variable that throws off that damn formula. So what makes you think that you're going to get the exact same results? And of course, as a result, they kind of, you know, rob the world of the thing that actually makes them stand out because they're so desperately trying to fit in or look like this, you know, other person. And you know, you see this across every online course. So you get a podcaster who starts an online course about how to, you know, do an interview-based podcast, and everybody in the stupid course basically creates podcasts that look the same, sound the same, you know, have the same format, you know, follow the same exact structure. And of course, they don't have anywhere near the same degree of success because there are all these variables that aren't taken into account. And the thing is that the more that you deny that, the more that you have, you know, less chance of finding any semblance of originality or standing out. You know, the reality is that if you want to, you know, basically survive on the internet or build a brand, a business or any sort, whether you're a brand, business, or creator, standing out is, you know, in a sea of noise is essential to your survival. And so to me, you know, and one other person really informed this, my friend Mars Dorian, who's this brilliant artist. And the thing with Mars was that Mars had a way of expressing himself that, you know, whenever you saw his work, whether it rolled through your news feed or Instagram, whatever it is, even if he didn't put his name on it, you'll be like, the only person who could have done that is Mars, because he just such a distinct signature on it. And that was really inspiring to me. I thought, wow, I wish more people were like this. I wish more people would do the thing that makes them unique. And so that sort of formed the basis of Unmistakable, which is the idea that when you do what you do in the way that nobody else could do it, you basically have no competition. That you're better off being the only person who does something than trying to be the best person who does something. Now, the question of, is everybody unmistakable? That's an interesting one because people have said yes and people have said no. Now, I wouldn't say everybody is. I think everybody has the potential to be. And that's kind of a process of discovery, like you pointed out, you know, Adam, 10 plus years or whatever. It took me 3 to 4 years just to arrive at that conclusion of unmistakable. So this is a very sort of iterative process of putting work out into the world, seeing what resonates with people, seeing what resonates with you, and also figuring out what it is that, you know, sort of makes you unique and distinctive that you can contribute to the world.
So out of your hundreds and hundreds of interviews and shows that you've published, what is the one that's resonated the most with you, and what's one that's resonated the most with your listeners?
Do either of you guys have kids?
I have 4.
Yes, I have 1.
Which one is your favorite, Adam? So you get my point.
Depends on the day.
Same here, right? It's a tough question. There are certain ones that really stand out. I mean, the one that I always allude to is the guy who robbed 30 banks. It's kind of like, how the fuck did you rob 30 banks? The thing is that what is interesting, my friend Nikki Groom had a really good way of saying this. She said, everybody has a story worth telling. And I think as an interviewer, it's on you to pull that story out of them. Now, that being said, there are some that really, like I said, kind of stay with me. And it's never the people you would think. It's not the Tim Ferrisses or the Seth Godins or any of those. It's people you've never heard of. People who really kind of stand out, with this Harvard neuroscientist named Srini Rao. Granted, now he's, quite popular. I interviewed Andrew Yang, the presidential candidate, long before the 2020 campaign. I interviewed a porn star recently. That was actually fascinating.
Oh, which one?
A woman named Sarah Vandella.
I haven't heard of her.
Naresh has a wide knowledge of the actors and actresses.
Well, go listen to it, and it was actually really interesting because it just like suddenly after that I was like, wow, I can't look at your porn anymore.
Wow. Andrew Yang actually, my company, we place experts in media, and he did a whole tour, I think back in 2018, 2019, promoting his book. So I was able to place him as well in various media. I'm a fan, even though I'm voting for Trump. I'm part of the gang. I donated. I got a bumper sticker. So I was a fan of his. But going back to your books right now, and you kind of touched on this, but I not fully. But there's a lot of depression and sadness going around. People stuck at home. We talked about just kind of how to bounce back. But as far as the mental issues, what are your tips to overcome the depressions?
Yeah, this is a tough one because this is such an odd sort of circumstance that the normal rules don't apply, right? I think that to me, the people who have it the absolute worst, and I'm not sure that I'm really even qualified to address their situation, are the ones who are living alone. That is really, really tough because we just know that, social isolation has, such a, toxic impact on mental well-being. And, I think that's a tough one. But I think the real opportunity here, at least in my mind, to, kind of jump off from that is to use this as an opportunity to connect with people, even if it's in, a digital form. But I'm not talking about, sending text messages or Facebook messages, but, there's this irony, I don't know how old you guys are, but, I grew up, I was born in 1978. So when we were kids, the future in our minds, we knew we would have arrived at sort of the Back to the Future moment when you would be able to see other people's face on the other end of the phone. And that's been possible for 10 years, and yet people hardly ever used it. I can't tell you that how few times prior to this situation that I had video chats with my parents. But I think that that fundamentally changed, when we're in this situation. So I think that one of the first things I would do is make deliberate efforts to connect with people who are important to you. Because that right there is one of those things that can really kind of lift you up. Just having some semblance of social connection. And so, I think that that is the first place I would start. Is I think that you've got to address that. That, of course, takes you into, sort of environment. Look, whether you like it or not, where you live, where you work, where you eat, all that stuff has a huge impact also on your energy. And if you are looking for, basically what you want is an environment that lifts you up, one that is clean, one that is, when you walk into it, you feel, motivated to do something. So that to me was a big one is to upgrade environments, which could mean decluttering, getting rid of crap, adding something in, whether it's pieces of art, whatever it is. This is going to be different for everybody. We have an episode about this called the 9 Environments That Make Up Your Life, which goes into much more detail. And then, the final one is not one that I honestly feel almost hypocritical bringing it up because I haven't been good about it, is health and fitness. Everybody knows that exercise makes you feel better, whether it's just going out for a walk or whatever it is. For me, it went to because I'm a surfer and snowboarder and I haven't been able to do those things. But those sort of pillars, I think, really are what matter. But I think, to me, you start at social connection. The other is to find some sort of activity, ideally that's not, digital, that gives you something to look forward to every day, something that, adds meaning to your life. Because I think that that's often, where you get stuck is, if work is the only reason you have to get up in the morning, then you need to find other reasons to get up in the morning.
Yeah, completely agree. And we've talked about all those on this show, the Work From Home show. Last question, Srini, before I give the floor to you. Did you ever end up working that corporate job after your MBA?
I did for a year, and that was it.
Oh, and I'm assuming you didn't like it, or it just,
It came to an end. I got let go because the project I was working on was kind of done, and that was kind of the end of it.
And did you start your side hustles before that corporate job or during your corporate job?
Yeah, I did. So just to give you the timeline, the summer of 2009 was the year that I started, if you remember correctly. I started the summer of 2009 with the blog, and then I got that job at the end of 2009. So I just kept it up the whole time while I was working at the job.
Gotcha. Okay. Awesome. Well, Srini Rao, host of the Unmistakable Creative Podcast, best-selling author. Some of them hit #1 on Amazon, of Unmistakable: Why Only is Better Than Best, The Small Army Strategy, a guide for turning fans and followers into fanatics and friends for life, and his latest book, The Scenic Route: What I've Learned from a Life That Hasn't Turned Out the Way I Thought It Would. And he certainly talked about many of those ways on this episode. His website's unmistakablecreative.com, unmistakablecreative.com. And as we brought up earlier, you can check him out on the very popular show Indian Matchmaking. It was like #1 on Netflix, I think, for eight or 9 days. So he is featured there. Srini Rao, any final thoughts you want to share with our listeners, or anything else you want to promote about anything that we discussed?
No, I mean, like I said, I'd love for you guys to check out Unmistakable Creative, but use this time wisely. It doesn't have to be, all gloom and doom. There is some, value to be gained from this.
Yep, absolutely right. And I'll tell you, Srini, you certainly are not a loser. I think that was just a mischaracterization. This is just lack of knowledge, I guess. If you think Srini is a loser after listening to this podcast, reach out to us. hello@workfromhomeshow.com. That's hello@workfromhomeshow.com. And check out our website. That's workfromhomeshow.com, workfromhomeshow.com. You can listen to this podcast episode as well as all of our previous 100+ episodes that we've done this year in 2020 alone. Get on our mailing list. Leave us a review on iTunes. Srini's got more than 950. We're at like 110. So let's see if we can try to catch up to him. He's doing a great job. His podcast is awesome. So that's workfromhomeshow.com for all of our previous episodes. And until next time, keep on working from home.